Hi, welcome. If you don't know me, I'm Anna, a clinical psychology doctoral candidate. This channel is all about real-life applications to psychology, so if that's your type of thing, hit like, subscribe, hit the bell notification button, all that good stuff. Today we're talking about this book, Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. This is a book by Susan Cain. I highly recommend it. I'm not going to be covering everything that she talks about in this video, but it's basically a pep talk for introverts, people that get told that they're quiet. I'm one of those people myself. I won't be going into very great detail about the psychological studies that she references throughout the book. It's a very well-written book anyway, so I highly recommend that you still buy it and read it if it speaks to you. This is really more just going to be a pep talk, like I mentioned, talking about introversion and extroversion more generally, the pros and cons of being an introvert versus an extrovert, as well as some takeaways for how we can come to accept ourselves as introverts and realize that ultimately we live in a society that very much values extroversion. So you may not know this, but actually introversion and extroversion as a trait was created as a concept by Carl Jung in 1921. His way of defining things, which is also the way that I tend to define these traits, is that introverts get energy from alone time and extroverts get energy from social interaction. Introverts also tend to get overwhelmed by stimulation and are more risk aversive. Extroverts tend to thrive on stimulation and are more thrill-seeking. Extroverts tend to be assertive and dominant, whereas introverts tend to dislike conflict and try to avoid it. Extroverts think out loud. Introverts prefer to think in their own heads or in writing if possible. Extroverts tend to be more impulsive. Introverts tend to take more cautious choices. Extroverts concentrate better when they're stimulated. Introverts concentrate better when they're less stimulated, when it's more quiet. Introverts tend to be something known as highly sensitive people more often, also conflated with a concept of empaths. We'll get to that, I promise. We'll get to it at some point in some video. But it's true, introverts tend to be higher in empathy, although when they feel overstimulated, their empathy can actually go down significantly because they're so overwhelmed. Introversion is often correlated with social anxiety and shyness, but social anxiety is painful, whereas introversion is not necessarily painful. We're all kind of on a spectrum. As Jung said, there is no such thing as a pure extrovert or a pure introvert. These are all on a continuum, and it's estimated that about 30% of the population are introverts. There seems to definitely be a temperamentally or pretty biologically and genetically ingrained component to this. Kagan did a longitudinal study in which he found that there are some high reactive babies who get very overstimulated easily, and those went on to grow up and turn into introverts. Whereas the low reactive babies who enjoyed stimulation and were not overwhelmed by it went on to become extroverts. So if you have a baby, definitely ring some bells and flash some colors and see how they'll react. If they're like punk rockers, they may end up to be introverts because they're feeling very overstimulated, and if they are not quite reactive to stimulation, they may grow up to be extroverts. High reactive kids are more sensitive to both stress and stability. So introverts are more likely to face difficulties if they have a stressful upbringing, but they're also more likely to flourish under healthy circumstances. So in conclusion, high reactivity on a very visceral level seems to be the biological basis of introversion. These traits are about 40 to 50% heritable, so environment and upbringing do play a very substantial role as well. But Cain talks about something that kind of blew my mind, which I think we all unconsciously know, but I've never stopped to think about, which is the extrovert ideal. Europeans tend to be very extroverted, whereas East Asians and Africans tend to be more introverted. And there are of course exceptions to this norm. Like in Finland, it's said to be famously introverted. Apparently they have an expression, how can you tell if a Finn likes you? He's staring at your shoes instead of his own. So of course there will be exceptions to the rule. But in the US specifically, the extroversion is through the roofs, like way higher than in Europe even. There's something called the extroversion ideal, which refers to the culture of promoting extroversion and pathologizing introversion. And Cain talks about how it arose out of the culture of personality, an era during which people want to be entertained by others as opposed to just wanting everyone to honor their own personal values like hard work and treating your family well and stuff like that. People these days much more want to sell their personality to use it to lead and entertain others. And nowadays people treat social interactions more like going to the movies, like they expect their friends to be fascinating rather than just good people that mind their own business. And people say that they value individuality, but really they just want to surround themselves with extroverts, and they try to change introverts to be more extroverted. Talkative people are rated as more competent, more likable, smarter, better looking, more interesting, and more desirable as friends. As a child, introverts often hear their parents apologizing for their quietness. University admissions officers look for the most extroverted candidates rather than the most qualified ones. Who can market themselves matters more than who is actually the most qualified for the position. In classrooms, the loudest people overshadow the quiet, even if their ideas aren't always the most exceptional. I was just talking to a friend about this. She was the one that recommended this book, and she mentioned that she was like in a Zoom group meeting. What are they called when they like split you into the little small rooms? A Zoom room. They're horrible things, horrible creation. Anyway, she was saying that like there was no room for her to speak. Everyone was talking on top of each other. There was no reflective listening, none of that. If you are not extremely talkative, you don't even stand a chance to speak your mind. And other people are not exactly caring to listen to what other people say and to make sure that everyone gets an equal voice. And teachers and professors also punish the quiet through participation points, through public and negative comments about their quietness, expressing concern for somebody being quiet, creating classroom dynamics where groups and group discussions are to be expected, but not settings in which introverts tend to thrive, such as independent time and quiet time and brainstorming on your own. Introverts, interestingly, tend to prefer online communications and tend to put themselves out there more online than they do in real life. This definitely rings true for me. I mean, obviously I have a YouTube channel where I talk about different things, and I'm an incredibly introverted person. I would not be able to do this in real life. And you know, there's nothing really wrong or inauthentic about that. Introverts too are just seeking connection in a less stimulating and less overwhelming way, in a way that allows them to take their time and choose their words carefully and put them in writing if need be before they translate into spoken word. There's nothing wrong with expecting people to go with the approach that makes the most sense for them. And if the internet makes that possible for people, I think that's a good thing. Another way that the extrovert ideal shows up is that in group settings, the most assertive and domineering always get their way, and it's not always the best way, which can sometimes lead to negative outcomes for the whole group. Leaders don't actually need to be extroverted, and large group settings are minimal for them actually, and they can also be done remotely, especially these days. And a lot of strong leaders are described as quiet, humble, modest, reserved, shy, mild-mannered, understated. Introverted leaders are also more likely to listen to good ideas and implement suggestions. So what are some of the benefits of being an introvert and some of the pitfalls of this extroversion ideal that we live in the US? Some studies suggest that the most creative people tend to be introverts. Introverts are also less reward sensitive and therefore more successful at regulating their feelings of desire and excitement, which can be helpful in circumstances such as at a casino or taking high-risk decisions such as on Wall Street. Introverts tend to slow down when they make a mistake, whereas extroverts actually speed up, causing even more mistakes. Introverts are less likely to showcase overconfidence, which is confidence that does not match up with their actual ability. Extroverts tend to be more overconfident than introverts. After elementary school, where extroverts reign, from high school to college, all the way up to grad school, introverts outperform extroverts, and they tend to know more in all subjects, and they also score higher on critical thinking tests. Groupthink in the extrovert ideal is also a huge pitfall. Groupthink is when everyone just kind of falls in line, goes with the mass, what the mass believes, doesn't really think critically about anything. That's basically the internet. And it's interesting because a lot of the American education and occupational industries are focused very much on teams and teamwork for new initiatives and for creativity, yet teamwork doesn't actually work better than time spent alone thinking and brainstorming. Actually, college students who study alone tend to learn more over time than those who study in groups. I remember when I was in college, all my friends were like going to the library as a group to study, and I couldn't relate. I just figured that would be so distracting. I would rather just stay at home in my room and just study on my own and do flashcards. Performance in group settings also gets worse the more members of a group there are. And this is for a few reasons. The first one is social loafing, which is when some people just pawn off work onto the person who is more likely to do it or more proactive. Another reason is production blocking. When one person is speaking, everyone else has to listen, and so all these people who could be spending that time thinking about creative endeavors on their own are instead forced to distract their attention with something else. And also there's the evaluation apprehension, which is the fear of embarrassing yourself in front of others. Of course, you don't really have that fear if it's just you, a piece of paper, and your thoughts. Studies also show that the top computer programmers are from companies that workers have the most quiet and privacy, as opposed to open plan office spaces. I'm just going to read you an excerpt from Kane's book because it tells you all you need to know about open plan spaces. Open plan offices have been found to reduce productivity and impair memory. They're associated with high staff turnover. They make people sick, hostile, unmotivated, and insecure. Open plan workers are more likely to suffer from high blood pressure and elevated stress levels to get the flu. They argue more with their colleagues. They worry about coworkers eavesdropping on their phone calls and spying on their computer screens. They have fewer personal and confidential conversations with colleagues. They're often subject to loud and uncontrollable noise, which raises heart rates, releases cortisol, the body's fight or flight stress hormone, and makes people socially distant, quick to anger, aggressive, and slow to help others. So yeah, sounds great. People also learn better after a quiet stroll through the woods as opposed to a noisy walk down a city street. Multitasking isn't actually possible. So in teamwork, when you have to both focus on your own thoughts and on what someone else is doing, not possible. Like, we now know that multitasking doesn't actually work. You're just shifting very quickly between different tasks, which depletes essential nutrients in your brain. The ASH study is a very famous study that showed that people pick wrong answers on a visuospatial test if they see others doing it. It's a pretty well-known, famous study about groupthink and how people don't think for themselves and just go with what other people are doing. Newer neuroscience studies suggest that actually people aren't conscious of this. Groupthink genuinely changes their visuospatial perception in that moment, which is extremely dangerous because they're not thinking, oh, everyone's going along with this choice, maybe I should pick it too because what if they're right? They're genuinely thinking, this person picked this response. Yeah, that response is correct. And that is incredibly dangerous. So yeah, there are a lot of downfalls and pitfalls of groupthink and of the extrovert ideal in general. There's also something called the introvert ideal. Asians and Asian Americans tend to value introversion and quietness more. This is also linked to the fact that they tend to be more collectivistic. In collectivism, there's a sense of everyone is interconnected. It's not just about your individual well-being and your individual desires. It's about also respecting the people around you because that also affects you as well. And it makes sense. If you value your individual well-being above all else, it stands to reason that you'll be more loud and want to talk just for the sake of talking. Social anxiety disorder in Japan, which is called taijin kyofusho, is not just about fearing that you'll embarrass yourself, it's about fearing you'll embarrass others. Kane spoke at length in her book about how Asian Americans struggle to reconcile their cultural values with the extroversion ideal that they experience in the US. She spoke about how class participation is perceived by Asian Americans as talking nonsense, and I could completely relate to this. I remember when I was in high school, I would always hear this expression from like teachers that there's no such thing as a stupid question. If you have a question or a comment, you should absolutely say it. It would be beneficial for everyone. And there was one classmate in particular who very much took up this mantra, and she asked the most simple questions that if only she had just spent a moment thinking about it or doing the readings or just a split moment trying to answer it for herself, she would have realized that she already knew the answer. And it was really quite inconsiderate because we would all be left after the class had already ended and she would just have more questions, and it was really disrespectful of our time, and most of us already knew the answer to those questions. I think it's really important these days that we take a step back and ask ourselves before we speak, would this benefit someone else to hear, or is this something better suited for a one-on-one conversation or just taking a moment to just think for a second. And extroversion is not always a sign of well-being. I remember when I was going through a phase where I was very much a social butterfly, going out a lot, meeting a lot of people knew me. I was at this party and I was talking to someone, and a bunch of different people were coming up and saying hi to me. And the person I was talking to after a while said like, wow, like you really know everyone. I was not in a good place in my life. I was trying to fill this void inside of me with social connections because I hadn't learned how to be okay with myself. Although I was and still am very much an introvert, it's like you need to be okay with yourself. And I think this is true of introverts and extroverts. You need to be okay with your own company. You need to not freak out if it's just you and your thoughts, because if so, it merits asking yourself the question, what's going on? Like, why am I so scared of myself? So for an introvert, suddenly behaving very extroverted can be a sign of something going wrong in their life. And probably the alternative is true as well. If an extrovert suddenly doesn't want to go out, doesn't want to see anyone, that can definitely be cause for concern. Now, to look a little bit at the other side of things. I don't want to use the expression devil's advocate because I despise that expression, but let's just examine the other side of the argument. Sometimes it is important to speak up. Like, that's just the fact of the matter. Sometimes it is beneficial for you to showcase that you know something, to speak up, to be assertive, to lead, to market yourself, to entertain people. Verbal fluency and sociability are also the two most important predictors of success, according to a Stanford Business School study. Learning to speak eloquently and frequently can increase your salary, job performance, academic grades, get you more friends, get you more liked by people, get you closer to your goals and desires, etc. And I know firsthand how frustrating it can feel when you're pulling teeth and the other person just won't engage in a bi-directional conversation. At some point when that happens, you kind of have to wonder, does this person actually have anything to say? Is it just that they're in their own head thinking they just need a little bit more time to express themselves, or is it that this person genuinely doesn't think or speak? It's hard to connect with someone like that, and connection is crucial no matter whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. But I think there's room for us to discuss the middle ground of this discussion. Both introverts and extroverts have unique skills that must be valued and growth edges that must be combated sometimes. It's the trade-off theory of evolution. A trait can either be adaptive or maladaptive depending on context. Extroversion is great for seeking out opportunities, building a pack, acting on things, and introversion is great for watching out for threats and being a little bit more risk aversive. Our ancestors back in the savannah, when they were being watched by predators, they had to really look out and kind of be wary of what was surrounding them, as opposed to just running out into the savannah and getting eaten by a lion. Extroverts are talkers and introverts are thinkers. And I don't mean this to say that like extroverts don't think. I think extroverts think via talking and introverts think by thinking and then have to translate that into talking. Both are important and one is not necessarily superior to the other. Extroverts are geared to respond, introverts are geared to inspect. The best teams and the best groups are made up of a combination of both introverts and extroverts who can complement each other's styles. The best teaching and the most creativity stems from fairness in allowing both introverts and extroverts to get the environments needed for them to flourish. What does that sound? My hope with this video is not that now you think extroverts suck, the extrovert ideal sucks, being an introvert is cooler than I thought. My hope is to bring awareness to the fact that there's nothing wrong with being an introvert, that both introversion and extroversion have their perks and their adaptive functions, and to validate those of you that were made to feel like there was something wrong with you because you're an introvert. There's nothing wrong with you. You do not have to conform to a culture that goes against every grain in your body, that leaves you feeling energetically depleted and self-conscious. You are fine just the way you are, and there is nothing wrong with choosing your words carefully, with choosing to stay in on a Friday night, with preferring not to work in groups, with not wanting a big friend group. No matter how much the extrovert ideal society tells you that you're less than because you're quiet, I want you to remember that you are perfectly fine just the way you are. You don't need to force yourself to talk if you have nothing to say, if it doesn't benefit you, or you simply just don't want to. You have a right to take your time before responding, to think in silence, to select your words carefully, to put things into writing first, to ask for a way of learning or creating that honors your energy needs. I remember I was once having a conflict with a peer, and I preferred to put things in writing, choose my words carefully, think about what I wanted to say to not come off too aggressive or too passive aggressive, and that was my preferred means of communicating. And this person very much wanted to just talk over the phone, and I said, no, like, I'm sorry, that's not going to work for me. Like, I'm not able to express myself as well as I would like in that way, and therefore I would prefer to do this in a way that works for both of us. All the people who judged or shamed you for your quietness were just showing their own narrow-mindedness. It was never a you problem, because there are plenty of advantages to the way that you think and speak. If they can't see that, they're missing out. If there's nothing to say to someone, you don't need to feel uncomfortable with the silence. That's on them if they feel uncomfortable. I remember one time I was studying abroad and I was with a friend who was very social, very extroverted, and we were just walking down the train station. And at one point she turns to me and she goes, you know, you're the only friend that I feel comfortable in silence with. With anyone else, I would feel really uncomfortable. And, you know, that's nice to hear. Like, it's good to hear that, because I'm perfectly okay with silence. I don't need to be yapping every second of the day. I would hope that that would make the other person feel more comfortable as well. But at the same time, I kind of flagged that and I was like, oh, like, the fact that you're saying this kind of shows you're not comfortable with it, because it's like there's a lot of attention to the fact that there was a pause or quietness. And yes, there will be times to speak up when you have to turn on your extrovert mask, when you need to entertain people or sell them something, be it an interview, a class presentation, moving to a new place where you don't have a friend group yet. When those moments emerge, do try to turn on the charm, and I have many videos on how to behave more assertively, more confidently, more charismatically. Check those out for some concrete tips. But per the free trait theory, we're not just doomed to be one way. We're born with certain personality traits, and we can also choose to act out of character sometimes. It's kind of linked to the rubber band theory, which says that people and personalities are kind of like a rubber band. You can stretch it out a considerable amount, but of course there's a limit. At some point, it's really hard to go further than that. So figure out your limits, figure out how far you're able to stretch yourself, and also make sure that you find solace and are able to recharge your energy, and to make sure that you're not burning yourself out by constantly being completely outstretched. Like, if you have a lot of social meetings during a week, you know, maybe it's a good idea to not have any social events after hours so that you can kind of recharge. And studies show that the introverts who are most successful at masking as extroverts are the ones who are high in self-monitoring. So things like just being mindful of how you come off to people, regulating very small behaviors like, oh, I realize I'm hunching over right now, or I realize I'm not speaking as much as other people. Just paying close attention to small things like that. But just know deep down that there's nothing wrong with your default way of being, because just the same, it's sometimes beneficial for extroverts to behave more like introverts. They sometimes have to learn to be quiet, to truly listen, to be alone with their thoughts. We all have our growth edges. Hope this video was validating. Are you an introvert or an extrovert? I will put a test down below, and please write your percentage if you feel comfortable, so that we can all kind of compare and see who's the most or least introverted and learn from each other. If you haven't already, hitting like and subscribing and the bell notification button would all be much appreciated. If you don't want to do that, that's fine too, and I'll see you in a few days.